So here's where we are on this. We started out with the family of Terah over here in Ur, right? Who are Terah's three boys?
Nahor, Haran, and
The main one.
Abraham.
Yep, and Abram. So Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Who died in Ur? Haran died in Ur. So then Terah and who else goes up to Haran?
Abraham, Sarai, and Lot.
Okay. And who dies up here?
Terah.
Terah. How old is Terah when he dies?
205.
205 years old. And then Abram receives promises from God and direction from God. When he's in Haran, how old is he when he receives these directions? And promises?
75.
75 years old. And God leads them down into Canaan right here. And when their son Isaac is actually born, how old is Abraham?
100.
All right.
And Sarai is 90.
Okay. So what we have here is we have Abraham who had a son, Isaac. Eventually what we'll see is that Isaac gets married and has two children of his own that we are focused on. And who are they? Who are the two sons of Isaac? Okay. Jacob and Esau. All right. And then Jacob also is known as what? God gives him another name. Israel. So Jacob also becomes known as Israel. All right. Jacob has how many sons? 12. And he has 12 sons, and son number 11, what is his name? His name is Joseph. Okay. So at some point, Joseph is born, and he always has this job of going and checking on his brothers in the fields, right? So he checks on his brothers in the field. His brothers don't really like it. In the short story of all of this is the brothers get very sick of Joseph. And so they throw him into the pit. They eventually sell him, and he gets sold as a slave in Egypt to a man named Potiphar. And because of Joseph's trusting God and his good work ethic, he works his way up the ladder until he's number 2 in the house of Potiphar. In the house of Potiphar, when he's number 2, he gets accused of something. What does he get accused of? Raping who? Potiphar's wife. So he gets thrown in jail. And at some point when he gets thrown in jail, then there's 2 other guys that come in there, and they both have dreams. Through God, Joseph's able to interpret the dreams, and he asks the cupbearer who survives, when he goes back to the king, to remember him. And so for 2 more years, Joseph sits in jail while he waits and waits and waits until the Pharaoh has a dream. And the cupbearer says, I know somebody who can interpret that. They go and get Joseph. Joseph says, in fact, they can't interpret it, but God can. And so at that point, we see that Joseph, because of his hard work, his trust in God, becomes number 2 in the kingdom of Egypt over here. So he's number 2 here, and he begins to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. It says, we're going to have 7 years of plenty, and then we're going to have 7 years where there's famine. So he devises this great plan. He gets everybody in motion, and he basically rescues the future of this country right here. But the problem is that there's also a famine in the area of Canaan where Israel and all of his brothers, Jacob and all of his brothers, are living at this time. And so when he gets to be number 2 in power and the brothers come over here, eventually the whole family, this whole family, they move to Egypt. And they live here for a while. Now it goes great because they live there and they begin to really multiply, and the pharaohs, one after another, they remember that Joseph was a big hero in this. So we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. It says this. In time, Joseph and each of his brothers died, ending that generation. But their descendants had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so quickly, they soon filled the land. So we're looking at the growth of a new nation, this whole nation of Israel. Remember, Israel is just Jacob's other name. And so we're looking at the really fast growth of all of them. Remember also the promise that was made to Abram when he was up here, before he and Sarah could have babies. What was the promise up here that was impossible to happen for them?
It would be a father of both many nations.
Yeah, and that
Have descendants as many as-
descendants as numerous as the stars, right? Like dust, you can't even count all of them. And then when he finally was able to have Isaac, and then Isaac then had Jacob and Esau, and Jacob had these 12 sons. These 12 sons move over here. They begin to live in the land, and they begin to multiply so quickly that they filled the land. In my mind, I'm thinking about this whole thing, and in perspective, I imagine if Abraham ever knew what would so quickly become of his family, because at this point, 0 kids and 0 possibility. But then suddenly, when God's promising him all these numerous descendants, by this time, they're all over the place. And so you see God's promise actually coming true in that time. Then look at verses 8 through 11. It says, Then a new king came to the throne of Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He told his people, These Israelites are becoming a threat to us because there are so many of them. We must find a way to put an end to this. If war breaks out, if war breaks out, then they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country. So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves and put brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down under heavy burdens. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. And so a new king comes into power. He no longer remembers what Joseph did, and he no longer remembers how Joseph was able to save the whole country, rescue them out of this famine that they had had so many years before. But he also looked around and saw that they were so numerous. And here's what his fear was, is that the other countries that were nations that were around Egypt would see that this nation of Israel was actually living within the nation of Egypt. The nation of Israel would join with them, attack Egypt, basically plunder them, wipe them out, and just walk out with every single thing that they had. It was too big of a threat. And the king of Egypt said, we can't let this happen. So what we need to do is all these numerous people from Israel, all of them they're doing really well. They probably had a lot of things. We've got to really oppress them and push them down so that they're not nearly as able to rise up and attack us. Then they won't nearly be as attractive to all of these outside people. And so let's make them slaves and wear them down and give them very heavy burdens to bear. So that's what he's done, actually. Now, big picture on this whole deal. Who also wants to wear down the children of God and make them of no threat whatsoever? That's exactly right. And you can't forget the big picture of this. Because that big picture doesn't stop, even until this very day. Is that our enemy, Satan, also wants to weigh us down so that we will not be any threat to anybody else. Thoughts or ideas? Okay, look at verse 15. Chapter 1 still, verse 15. It says, Then the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave his order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women give birth, kill all the boys as soon as they're born. Only allow the baby girls to live. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king and allow the boys to live too. So here's what we see in verse 15 and 16. The king ramps up the attacks. Because whenever he's really bearing down on them, it's not enough. So then he decides, you know what we're going to do? We're going to start killing all the baby boys. So he ramps up the attack, but the Israelite midwives counter this attack. And what they're looking at is something very interesting. I think it plays out for us too. You got to look at a hierarchy of authorities. They live inside of Egypt, right? And there is a king in Egypt. What happens when the orders of the king and the orders of God contradict each other? What you do is you default to the higher authority. And the higher authority in this case is actually God. Now I'm going to tell you, this is a point of relevance for us. Whenever we have government over us, that does give us orders and has expectations of us. But when our government's expectations of us counter or contrary to the expectations that God has of us, what do you do in that case? What do?
Default to God.
You default to the higher authority, which is God. And that's what we actually do. So we see some of these things playing out right now, and it's a challenge we have. So it's a point of relevance that when you're talking about some kind of political thing or government thing or new laws or whatever, and what do we do as believers in it, this is a place where you can bring them into this hierarchy. You default to the higher authority, who is God, and you can bring them right back into a story like this. Because what you're always wanting to do is build a bridge back into the story. To me, it doesn't matter where in the story you connect them, but you connect them where their interest lies, and then you begin to work the story out from that point. Any other thoughts? All right. So we see in this, in verse 18, then it says, the king called for the midwives. Why have you done this, he demanded. Why have you allowed these boys to live? Sir, they told him, the Hebrew women are very strong. They have babies so quickly we cannot get there in time. And this is the part I like. This is the slam on Egypt. They're not slow in giving birth like those Egyptian women. Like, okay, they got a little dig in. But maybe they were slower. And God was really blessing the people of Israel and causing them to have a lot of children, to outnumber a lot of these others. But in verse 20 we see, so God blessed the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. So God blesses them. A tough choice is often the right choice. And that's what they did. And this is the thing. The Hebrew women feared God. We talked about in our last lesson about this whole thing with Abram. And Abram had a few things. One is that he took a stand for God no matter the circumstance. He held tightly to God's word and held loosely to what? Everything else. Right? And we look at these midwives, they're quite heroic because they're taking a stand for God regardless of the circumstances. They're holding tightly to Him and loosely to everything else. And even when confronted by the king himself, they don't back down. They just stand their ground and they're right there. Now we look in verse 22 that the king changes his tactics. The Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Remember, first he gave the order to the Hebrew midwives. It didn't work, so he's changing tactics. He gave this order to all of his people. Throw all the newborn Israelite boys into the Nile River, but you may spare the baby girls. Oh, well, thanks. Thanks for letting us spare the girls. Just kill all the boys and throw them all into the river. But what it does show us again is that the enemy is ever changing his tactics to try and find the place where it will work against God's people. So we have to be vigilant every single day. You know what this comes back into is the guy right here, Noah. Because remember, Noah was blameless in all his ways, and he did what with God? He walked with God. And this is where, if we're going to be facing a battle where our enemy is constantly changing his tactics on us, we got to be walking with God, dependent on Him consistently, nonstop. And not the other alternative of walking with God, the one where you check in with God, check in with God, check in with God, because that is the one, and we talked about this, when you're checking in with God, what you're doing is holding on tightly to God, then holding on tightly to something else. Holding on tightly to God, then holding on tightly to something else. This is a common problem with believers. And the thing is we've got to be focused on this, focused on God nonstop all the time. All right, so then we come to chapter 2 and verses 1 through 9 say this. During this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw what a beautiful baby he was and kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a little basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. And she put the baby in a basket and laid it among the reeds along the edge of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen to him. Soon after this, one of the Pharaoh's daughters came down to bathe in the river, and her servant girls walked along the river bank. When the princess saw the little basket among the reeds, she told one of her servant girls to go get it for her. As the princess opened it, she found the baby boy. His helpless cries touched her heart. He must be one of the Hebrew children, she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you, she asked. Yes, do, the princess replied. So the girl rushed home and called the baby's mother. Take this child home and nurse him for me, the princess told her. I will pay you for your help. So the baby's mother took her baby home and nursed him. A family is caught up in the work of God. And this is what's really interesting. A family themselves get very caught up in the work of God. Because with this baby, a baby is born. He's then hidden. Then he's released. Then he's unexpectedly rescued and then brought back home. And this is the spiritual irony of the whole deal, is the baby who should have been killed and it would never be able to be raised by his own mother gets rescued by the princess, who sends the baby right back home to his very own mother to be raised in the first several years of his life.
Hey, Darren, can I
Yes.
point out, it's even better than that. As a guy who runs a faith-based ministry, I constantly look for wealth transfer in the Bible, and it says this mom got paid to nurse a baby that was her own.
Yes.
So, here is secular Potiphar who's paying for ministry that's going on that's ultimately going to change the course of history.
Yes.
Pretty amazing stuff.
It is. And what it points to is God's sovereignty in the whole
Yeah,
deal.
absolutely.
I mean, God is in control of everything. And what I'd say too, we talked about that this morning with the whole Abram thing, is that there are times when it seems like God's not in control or God's not aware of your situation. But in this whole deal, God is aware of what's going on every single step of the way, and He's in control of it. And I think it's so easy for us to say it, because you know what we do? We read this whole story, and then we get way down here in history, and we look at how they go, well, yeah, of course, God's in control of everything, and we saw how it's all going to work out. God always works out things. Well, that's great for a biblical story, but wait till you have your own personal challenge or difficulty or tragedy or whatever. What happened to your big story about how God it can be trusted and works out everything? Where is that story now? And that's why we have these biblical accounts, so that we can see in the middle of my greatest crisis, I go back and go, all I can do is trust God. Remember we talked about last week, God loves a roadblock. And the reason He loves a roadblock is because when He runs you into a roadblock, you cannot get yourself out of it. The only way out of it is for God to get you out of it. And that's what this is right here. It's another roadblock of what am I actually going to do? And at that point, God takes you out of the roadblock, and those three things happen whenever He takes you out of the box. He's glorified. Others see the truth of Him.
Yes.
And the person who's a believer, their faith is strengthened. Those three things happen outside of that box. All right. So verse 10 says this. Later, when he was older, the child's mother brought him back to the princess who had adopted her son, and the princess named him Moses. For she said, I drew him out of the water. Moses is what kind of name? It's an Egyptian name. Yeah. So he was actually, 10 or so years old, actually, when he goes back to live in the palace. And he was raised. So he's raised for a while as an Egyptian person. Now, ethnically, he's an Israelite. But culturally, he becomes an Egyptian. So he's this interesting mix of a character that's being raised. And again, if you're going to go back with Mike's wealth transfer thing, I mean, basically, the Pharaoh is raising the deliverer of the Israeli people. That's exactly what he's doing. Is he's raising that kid up to be very intelligent and very strong and very well versed in a lot of different things. So it's interesting how God is still in control. This is the deal. Who owns all the resources of the world? God is the owner of all of this, right? So He uses His resources as He pleases, even those resources that aren't aware or don't even agree with Him are still available for His use. So this is what I'm going to say. let's go back to the world of politics and government in our own world, right? Why do we pray for our governors and presidents and senators? Why do we pray for these people? Can God use them even when they're unwilling to be used by God? Are they not a resource? So we should pray for them constantly. And don't expect of these governors and presidents and senators and representatives, don't expect of them, expect of who?
God.
Expect of God while you're praying for them, okay? All right. Now, look at this next piece. Chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. I'm going to make up a word, sort of. When we lived in Indonesia, you could take a noun and make it into a verb, and it all worked out just fine. So I'm going to take the word purpose, and we're going to make it into a verb, okay? And I'm going to call this section, Moses purposes small. Okay? He purposes small. So look at this, chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his people, the Israelites. Notice it says he went out to visit his people, the Israelites. And he saw how they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrew slaves. After looking around to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. The next day, as Moses was out visiting his people again, he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. "What are you doing hitting your neighbor like that?" Moses said to the one in the wrong. "Who do you think you are?" the man said. "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Do you plan to kill me as that you did that Egyptian yesterday?" Moses was badly frightened because he realized that everyone knew what he had done. And sure enough, when the Pharaoh heard about it, he gave orders to have Moses arrested and killed. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and escaped to the land of Midian. When he arrived in Midian, he sat down at a well. Moses is around 40 years old. He takes a walk. He wants to see how his people are doing, the Israelites are doing. He's raised in the palace like an Egyptian, but he's still an Israelite at heart. So there's this conflict that's going on inside of him. But from this account, we see that his instinct is to be protective and to rescue the Hebrew man. Because when he goes up and he sees these 2 guys fighting over here, well, not fighting, but we see the Egyptian beating the Hebrew man, he looks around, he kills the dude, he looks around again, buries him, thinking that he's gotten away with it. The next day he goes out and there's 2 Hebrew men fighting. He doesn't kill the one that's in the wrong. He tries to reconcile them. You see, he's got 2 things going on inside of his heart. Inside of his heart, he has this innate desire to rescue and reconcile. It's just interesting to me. But here's the problem with it. Remember our little box and how God wants us to operate outside of the box? Because this is where he gets the glory out here. Here's the thing that will happen. Is even as a believer in the true God, if you stay in your box, you purpose very small. And what he did was he purposed the rescue of one guy, and he purposed the reconciliation of 2 other guys. And his purpose was small in this. And so I'm not going to dog him for that because I do the same thing. But this is the deal. As long as you stay in your box, your purpose is going to be small. And what happens to him? How does he get a bigger purpose? And according to this box, how does he get a bigger purpose? He needs to do what?
Get outside.
He's got to get outside the box. But not everybody realizes they're in a box. So, whenever God, in his sovereignty, arranges for people to find out, and it goes all the way back to the Pharaoh says he wants to do what to Moses? Arrest him and kill him. Moses finds out, and he does what? Moses is chased where? To Midian, but Moses is chased where?
Out of his box.
Outside of his box. God allows for a situation where he is chased outside of his box. Okay? All right, thoughts or ideas on this so far? Okay with it? All right, look at this. Verse 16. So, last of 15. So Moses arrives in Midian. He sits down by a well. So Midian is here. The desert out there. He sits down by a well after leaving this whole area. And look what happens in verse 16. Now, it happened that the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came regularly to this well to draw water and to fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But other shepherds would often come and chase the girls and their flocks away. This time, however, Moses came to them, and he's sitting here. Here comes 7 girls, and he's probably thinking, this has got to be some kind of mirage. I've just run away, and here comes 7 girls out in the middle of the desert. I mean, how is this true? But they come over there to water their flocks. Moses came to their aid, rescuing girls from the shepherds. Then he helped them draw water for their flocks. When the girls returned to Reuel has another name. It's also Jethro, okay? Those are both of his names. Their father, he asked, how did you get the flocks watered so quickly today? An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds, they told him. And then he drew water for us and watered our flocks. Where is he then? The father asked. Did you just leave him there? Go and invite him home for a meal. Moses was happy to accept the invitation. Obviously, he had nowhere else to go. Was happy to accept the invitation, and he settled down to live with them. In time, Reuel gave Moses one of his daughters, Zipporah, to be his wife. Later, they had a baby boy. Moses named him Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. So a new chapter starts with Moses in this whole thing. He's now over here in the land of Midian. He finds a home. He starts a new family. And for about 40 years, he learns how to live and survive in the desert. This will prove to be an invaluable skill and training for what will next happen with him. So then we look at chapter 3 and look at verses 1 through 10. One day Moses was tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro. Notice how his name now is Jethro. Jethro and Reuel, they're the same person, okay? So he's tending the flocks. So he's been out there. He's got a job. He's got a family. He's living life. He's settled in the desert. He knows how to live out there. Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he went deep into the wilderness near Sinai, the mountain of God. Suddenly the angel of the Lord appeared to him as a blazing fire in a bush. Moses was amazed because the bush was engulfed in flames, but it didn't burn up. Amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't this bush burning up? I must go over to see this. When the Lord saw that he had caught Moses' attention, God called to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses said. Do not come any closer, God told him. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. When Moses heard this, he hid his face in his hands because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord told him, you can be sure that I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries for deliverance from their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I'm aware of their suffering. So I've come to rescue them from the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own good and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey, the land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites live. The cries of the people of Israel have reached me, and I have seen how the Egyptians have oppressed them with heavy tasks. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You will lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So Moses saved one Hebrew man. He rescued one, and he's reconciling 2 others. Okay? But while Moses purposes small, God purposes big. And what we see is that now outside of his box, he starts to receive the purpose that God, just like Abram, remember what he did with Abram? God rolled his purpose onto Abram and into Abram. And now outside of the box, Moses is in a position, and he has the training in the background to actually receive all of this. And it's God's timing. God has worked all of this together, and God now is rolling a purpose onto and into Moses to go back to Egypt and rescue not just one Hebrew man, but rescue all of them out of the enemy's territory. But here's the thing, and we'll learn this later in the story, but the people of Israel, they're sort of not really connecting as closely with God as they could. So God wants to get them in a position so that they can be better reconciled with their true God also. And so he's bringing them out of this land for a much more massive rescue and reconciliation. Thoughts or ideas? All right. Exodus chapter 3, verses 11 through 14. Then God told him, I will be with you, And this will serve as proof that I have sent you. When you have brought the Israelites out of Egypt, you will return here to worship God at this very mountain. What mountain were they at? Mount what? Sinai. Okay? That's where he was. But Moses protested. If I go to the people of Israel and tell them the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they won't believe me. They will ask, well, which God are you talking about? What's his name? Then what should I tell them? And God replied, I am the one who always is, or I am who I am. Just tell them, I am has sent me to you. All right. So here's the thing, is that Moses actually struggles because Moses used to have a box over here in Egypt. Remember that box? And God basically chased him out of that box so that he had training over here for the next big part of his assignment. But what happens when you live here for a while? What do?
Get a new box.
You create a new box. And so what's happened over here is that Moses now has a new box in Midian. And the new box over here is struggling to leave that box. And so when God's telling him to leave and to go over here and to help rescue all of them, he starts to push back on God and say, but God, you don't understand. I don't want to be this person. Can you find somebody? I don't want to do this. And the thing is that's human nature. We always kick back at the edges of the box because we don't want to leave the box. I tell you, it's like when I lost a bet, okay? I used to be a youth director in Florida many years ago. And I made this bet. We had been to Pigeon Forge the year before, and I knew at Pigeon Forge it costs about $50 to bungee jump, right? So I made this bet with this guy named Brad. I said, Brad, if we get up to Pigeon Forge and it costs $15, I will bungee jump. But if it doesn't, then you will, if it costs more than that, then you will bungee jump. And so we're like, okay. Well, I know how much it costs. I've been there the year before, but Brad hadn't. I had the advantage of knowledge of something from the past, right? So we go all the way up there, and we get to Pigeon Forge. They have a special on bungee jumping that week. $10. Dang, I've got to be the one that, I don't like this kind of thing. So I've got to be the one that bungee jumps. So I am the youth director. I got 40 youth around me. What do you think I'm going to do? Am I going to not bungee jump? Suddenly lose all of my credibility, right? So I walk up this tower, and it's like 70 feet. And 70 feet looking up isn't that bad. 70 feet looking down is like 16 miles, right? And the thing is this, as I'm standing up there, and the guy's got me all harnessed up and everything, and I'm kind of shaking this a little bit, and he's got me all harnessed up and everything, and he says on the count of 3, just step off the platform. Just step off. That's all you got to do. So he goes, 1, 2, 3. I'm still standing here. I haven't stepped off the platform. Because the reason is that it's hard to take the first step out of the box. But at some point I looked down and I saw those kids, blah, blah, blah. I knew he wouldn't do it, kind of thing. It's too scary. I just did it. And I promise you, I felt like I hung in the air for about 5 seconds in disbelief of what I'd actually done. Drop all the way to the bottom. I thought, oh, good, it's over. But no, it's bungee cord. So I'm all the way back. I was like, oh, got to do this again. So all the way back up and forward. But that's the thing, is that when you're standing on the platform at the edge of your box, the hardest step is which one? The first step. And so we've got to take that first step. And that's where Moses is pushing back at God. I don't want to take the first step because we talked about Abram this morning. When Abraham was told to go and sacrifice his son, he needed to take the first step and aim at the next step that God had told him. The first step is go on this journey to the area of Moriah, and the next step is to go over there and sacrifice your son. So he knew the first step and he knew where to aim. And it's the same thing here with Moses. Take the first step, and what your aim is over there in Egypt. But the first step is the hardest one to take. All right. Any input? Okay. Let's look at verse 15. God also said, tell them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This will be my name forever. It has always been my name, and it will be used throughout all generations. Now go and call together all the leaders of Israel. Tell them the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Why is he repeating this so much?
It's important for people to remember.
Yeah, he needs to drill this into his brain. Because he needs to get this not just on a brain level, on a heart level. That I'm a whole lot bigger than just what you think I am. I've been in charge of this show for a lot longer than you've been alive. So your whole little life that you've lived over this 80 years is just a speck on the line of eternity. I've been doing this for a whole lot longer, and what it should do is build confidence in the true God that we serve. This will be my name forever, always has been, and will be used throughout all generations. Now go and call together all the leaders of Israel. Tell them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac, God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, God of Jacob, appeared to me in a burning bush. He said, you can be sure that I'm watching over you and have seen what is happening to you in Egypt. I promise to rescue you from the oppression of the Egyptians. I will lead you out of the land now occupied by lead you to the land now occupied by the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The leaders of the people of Israel will accept your message. Then all of you must go straight to the king of Egypt and tell him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us go on a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. God is doing this. This is what's interesting. Hear this closely, okay? God is sending Moses into the enemy territory to give them hope, to bring them news of a good and loving God, and to lead them out of captivity from the enemy's territory. Does this seem like it will repeat itself again? Because there's a foreshadowing, there's an echo, a pre-echo, however you call that, of what could happen, of what will happen later. When God eventually sends the Messiah, his own son, into a land of the enemy in order to bring them hope, to bring them good news of a good and caring God, and to lead them out of captivity into freedom and to rescue them. Okay? So this is significant. All right. God's plan is strategic, and it's based on whose perspective?
On his perspective.
On God's own perspective. So God does the planning, and he's calling Moses to follow that plan. And the important thing about following God's plan is his perspective is so much broader than ours that sometimes it won't make sense, but as a piece in the puzzle of history, it's exactly what needs to happen. That's why we are called to trust him. All right. 19 and 20. But I know the king of Egypt will not let you go except under heavy pressure. So I will reach out and strike at the heart of Egypt with all kinds of miracles. Then at last, he will let you go. God's power will overcome the enemy. But it won't happen immediately. And it will be challenging. And you will face difficulty. And it won't happen right away. So don't expect this immediate gratification kind of thing. I'm doing this according to my plan, my strategy, and my timing. And here's what it is. And I think the reason he tells him all of this is he wants him to stick it out. Because as soon as he gets down this road and it doesn't quite work out right in the beginning, he's going to think, maybe I misunderstood God. Or maybe God's plan wasn't right. But no. God's plan in the road he calls us down is hard and challenging sometimes. But just like Abraham, if you stick it out and get to the end, you get to see the great thing that God accomplishes. When Abraham went to sacrifice his son, he could have said no. But he would have missed the great thing that God accomplished, and he would have missed the great lesson that God was waiting to teach. So what did he do? Trusted him when everything seemed illogical. He still trusted God. Made it all the way through, stuck it out to the end, so he was there for the big show. And that's what he's trying to encourage Moses to do, is stick it out through all of this and be there for the big show. 13 through chapter 4, Exodus chapter 4, 13 through 17. Here we go again. But Moses pleaded again, Lord, please send someone else. He's still on the edge of the box. He can't take the first step. So what happens is this. When you're on the edge of the box and you can't take the first step, is God a cruel and condemning God, or is He a loving, compassionate Father who sometimes disciplines but does it in great love? Which one, A or B?
B.
He's B, right? So what's He going to do with Moses? He's not just going to, he's not condemning him or anything where he stands. What we see with him, because He knows Moses' heart, is He's going to resource him in order to be more willing to take that first step out of the box. Verse 14. The Lord did become angry with Moses because he's not willing just to just trust me. He did become angry with Moses. All right, He said. What about your brother Aaron the Levite? He's a good speaker, and look, he is on his way to meet you now. And when he sees you, he will be very glad. You will talk to him, giving him the words to say. I will help both of you speak clearly, and I will tell you what to do. Aaron will be your spokesman to the people, and you will be as God to him. He's not saying that he will be God, but basically what that means, you will be as God to Aaron. Who gives the instructions to Moses? God. And who's now going to give instructions to Aaron? Moses. And so He's just saying, like I'm giving you instructions, you're going to give him instructions. You're going to be, as a human on here, I'm going to give you the instructions, and you're going to basically run the show from this perspective. 17, and be sure to take your shepherd's staff along so that you can perform the miraculous signs that I have shown you. So God sends for Aaron. Aaron's going to speak. Moses is going to perform the miraculous signs. But what it does is it takes some of the pressure off of Moses so that he's willing to do this. Because God has purposed for Moses to be the one to go in and lead those people out. All right? And then the last bit right here. Verse 18 through 20. Then Moses went back home, talked it over with Jethro, his father-in-law. With your permission, Moses said, I would like to go back to Egypt to visit my family. I don't even know whether they are still alive. Go with my blessing, Jethro replied. 19. Before Moses left Midian, the Lord said to him, do not be afraid to return to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead. 20. So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and headed back to the land of Egypt. In his hand he carried the staff of God. Verse 27. Now the Lord had said to Aaron, go out to the wilderness to meet Moses. So Aaron traveled to the mountain of God, where he found Moses and greeted him warmly. Moses then told Aaron everything the Lord had commanded them to say, and he told them about the miraculous signs they were to perform. So Moses and Aaron returned to Egypt, called the leaders of Israel to a meeting. Aaron told them everything the Lord had told Moses, and Moses performed miraculous signs as they watched. The leaders were soon convinced that the Lord had sent Moses and Aaron, and when they realized that the Lord had seen their misery and was deeply concerned for them all, they bowed their heads and they worshiped. This whole thing is about the transformation of Moses. From a regular person to a person who has small purpose to a person who has God-sized purpose. And we see the whole transformation. But what we see also is that God was at work through this whole time. Because of his upbringing, his first 40 years, he knows all the ins and outs of the Egyptian kingdom, way of life, everything. Because of his second 40 years when he's living in the desert, and here's the interesting thing. He's living in the desert. I don't know of any communication or talking or what's going on between him and God. I don't know of any of that. And so you see this whole big waiting period for God to show up and tell me what to do next. You're looking at that. But here's what's interesting. This was not wasted time. For Moses learned all the skills and had all the training of what it would take to live in the desert. Because if this dude is going to lead all of them out of Egypt into the desert, your leader better know what it's like to live in the desert. Or else, if he falters, they will falter. So although this 40 years seems like waiting forever, God was very purposeful in it. And here's another point of relevance. When you're sitting around waiting for the next big thing for God to do it, he may be doing it right now. He very likely is doing it right now. So what I would say is hold tightly to God and embrace the place where he puts you today and learn everything you can where you are at the moment.